Thanks.
Let's get to Emily Wilkins, who has that story for us. Hi, Emily.
Hey, Morgan. Well, yes, the Senate just adopted a resolution that would overturn the powers that Trump used to set up many of his tariffs. This is the IEEPA. It's the one that's going in front of the Supreme Court and being debated on. You know, Congress, they do get to assert their power over whether or not the president can continue to use that. And so they put forward a resolution today. It's actually the third one this week that the Senate has approved. This one is on all tariffs that use IEEPA. We saw one yesterday focused on Canada and then one on Tuesday that was focused on Brazil. And you did see either 4 to 5 Republicans join with Democrats to overturn Trump's power. Now, it really is more of a symbolic vote at this point because we don't expect the House to be taking that up. So for now, it seems like Trump's tariffs will be in place. But of course, if you do see the Supreme Court or the courts go ahead and rule that the president can't use that power to impose tariffs or needs to check in with Congress.
Okay, so Congress just went nuclear on Donald Trump, and this might be the biggest power grab we've seen between the branches of government in decades. The Senate just passed a resolution stripping Trump of his tariff authority, the authority he's been using to impose trade duties on over 100 countries without asking Congress for permission. We're talking about a bipartisan rebellion where Republicans are joining Democrats to say enough is enough, you don't get to control the entire U.S. trade policy by yourself, and this isn't happening in a vacuum. The Supreme Court is simultaneously questioning whether Trump's use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs is even constitutional. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, literally said in oral arguments that this looks like an unconstitutional transfer of legislative power to the executive branch. So Trump is getting hit from both Congress and the courts at the same time, and his entire trade agenda is imploding in real time. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
You are seeing here that he does not have the support that is needed for him to continue using that for many of the tariffs that Trump has put in place.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, Emily, is what this means for the Supreme Court. If you're seeing this move out of Congress, does it in any way shift what we might expect to see come out of SCOTUS?
You know, Leslie, I'm not sure that what we're seeing here in the halls of Congress is going to necessarily impact SCOTUS and how they decide. But certainly if SCOTUS comes back with questions about the president's ability to use this, or if they say, hey, Congress needs to play a role here, you can already see that when it comes to the tariffs, there is some concern among members of Congress for the impact that they could have. We actually saw much more this year around Liberation Day. It did peter off some as a number of those tariffs were pulled back. But it does show that there are a number of lawmakers, including some in the president's own party.
Can you believe this? On October 30th, the Senate voted 51 to 47 to undo most of Trump's global tariffs. 4 Republicans broke ranks and voted with Democrats to pass this resolution. That's huge because it shows that even some members of Trump's own party think he's gone too far, that he's abusing emergency powers that were never meant to give presidents unlimited control over trade policy. And they're not just passing symbolic resolutions. Senators from both parties introduced a new bill that would require any new tariffs to be approved by Congress within 60 days. That would completely neuter Trump's ability to wake up one morning, decide he's mad at China or Europe or whoever, and slap tariffs on their products without congressional authorization. The bill also requires Trump to notify lawmakers within 48 hours of any tariff decision, restoring congressional authority over trade that's been slowly eroding for decades. Here's what makes this absolutely wild. Trump has been using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify his tariffs. This is a law from 1977 that gives the president power to regulate commerce during national emergencies. It was designed for situations like war or terrorism, where the president needs to act fast to protect national security. Trump has stretched that law to cover basically any trade dispute he wants. He declared a national emergency over trade with China, then Mexico, then Canada, then the European Union, until he'd imposed tariffs on products from more than 100 countries. He's claiming that everything from steel imports to cars to agricultural products represents a national security threat that requires emergency action. And for a while, Congress just let him do it because they were too divided to push back. But now that's changing. Lawmakers are looking at the economic damage these tariffs are causing, looking at how much power Trump has accumulated, and saying, wait a minute, this isn't what the Constitution intended. Come on, you know this has been a long time coming, right? Small businesses have been screaming about how Trump's tariffs are killing them. They're paying higher prices for imported materials. They're getting hit with retaliatory tariffs from other countries. They're laying off workers because they can't afford to operate anymore. Consumers are paying more for everything from electronics to food to cars because of these tariffs. And Trump's response has been basically tough luck. This is what America first looks like. But now Congress is saying, no, you don't get to unilaterally reshape the entire U.S. economy and cause this much disruption without our input. That's our job. We're the ones who are supposed to regulate commerce according to the Constitution. You're just supposed to enforce the laws we pass. And then the Supreme Court gets involved. On November 5th, just days ago, the court heard arguments in cases challenging Trump's tariff authority. Multiple justices expressed serious concerns about whether presidents should have this much power. Justice Gorsuch, who Trump himself appointed to the bench, was particularly critical. He talked about how this represents a ratchet toward continual accumulation of power in the executive branch at Congress's expense. That's a constitutional law professor way of saying Trump is trying to become a king and we need to stop it. When your own appointee is calling out your power grab in open court, you know you've gone too far. The court hasn't ruled yet, but based on the oral arguments, it looks like at least some justices are ready to impose serious limits on presidential tariff authority. If they rule against Trump, it would be a massive blow to his trade strategy and to executive power more broadly. But here's the problem. Even though the Senate passed this resolution, the House hasn't. House Republicans are blocking similar measures because they're more loyal to Trump than their Senate counterparts. And even if both chambers pass legislation limiting Trump's tariff powers, Trump has already said he'll veto it. He's made it clear he thinks this authority is essential to his presidency and he's not giving it up without a fight. So we're headed toward a constitutional showdown where Congress tries to override a presidential veto, where the Supreme Court might strike down the legal basis for the tariffs, and where Trump might just ignore everyone and keep doing what he wants anyway. This is a full-blown separation of powers crisis, and nobody knows how it ends. Let's break down exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what comes next in this absolutely insane fight over who controls American trade policy. All right, so let's dig into the legal and political dynamics here because this is way more complicated than just Congress versus Trump. First, we need to understand how Trump got this tariff authority in the first place. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, was passed in 1977 in the aftermath of Watergate when Congress was trying to rein in presidential power. Ironically, the law has been used by presidents to accumulate more power rather than less. The statute allows the president to regulate imports and exports during a national emergency that poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. The key word there is emergency. This was supposed to be used for crisis situations, not for routine trade policy. But Trump has interpreted emergency so broadly that it basically means any situation where he thinks the U.S. is getting a bad deal in trade. When Trump took office for his second term, he immediately started declaring national emergencies related to trade. He said the trade deficit with China is a national emergency. He said unfair trade practices by the European Union are a national emergency. He said dependency on foreign steel and aluminum is a national emergency. Each of these declarations triggered his authority under IEEPA to impose tariffs without congressional approval. And the tariffs weren't small. We're talking about duties of 25%, 50%, in some cases even higher on specific products. Those tariffs raised the price of imports, which is supposed to make American products more competitive. But in practice, it also makes everything more expensive for American consumers and businesses. And other countries retaliate with their own tariffs on American exports, which hurts U.S. farmers, manufacturers, and workers. For the first couple years of Trump's second term, Congress grumbled but didn't do much to stop him. Republicans controlled both chambers initially, and they weren't willing to challenge their own president. Democrats were in the minority and couldn't pass anything on their own. But the midterm elections changed the dynamics. Democrats took control of the Senate, and suddenly there was a possibility of bipartisan action to limit Trump's tariff powers. And some Republicans, particularly those from states that are getting hammered by retaliatory tariffs, started breaking ranks. Farmers in the Midwest are losing access to foreign markets. Manufacturers are paying more for materials. Even some business groups that normally support Republicans are lobbying against the tariffs because they're causing economic pain. That's the context for the October 30th Senate vote. The resolution that passed was brought under something called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to overturn executive actions with a simple majority vote. The resolution specifically targeted Trump's use of IEEPA to impose global tariffs, saying that Trump hadn't proven that a genuine national emergency existed and that his tariff declarations were an abuse of the statute. 4 Republicans voted with all the Democrats to pass it 51-47. Those 4 Republicans are from states where the economic damage from tariffs is particularly severe. They're facing constituents who are losing jobs, farms that are going bankrupt, businesses that are closing. For them, voting against Trump on this issue is actually politically necessary to survive their next elections. But passing a Congressional Review Act resolution is just the first step. The resolution now goes to the House, where it faces a much tougher challenge. House Republicans are more uniformly loyal to Trump. The Speaker has already indicated he won't bring the resolution up for a vote. Even if somehow it did pass the House, Trump would veto it. And overriding a presidential veto requires a 2/3 majority in both chambers. That's not happening with the current composition of Congress. So the Senate resolution is more symbolic than anything else. It's a shot across the bow, a warning to Trump that his tariff strategy is losing political support, even among Republicans. But it's not going to directly stop the tariffs. That's why senators are also working on actual legislation to permanently limit presidential tariff authority. The bill they introduced would require congressional approval for any new tariffs within 60 days. If Congress doesn't vote to approve the tariffs, they automatically expire. The bill also requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of any tariff decision and to provide detailed justification for why the tariffs are necessary. This would restore what the sponsors call constitutional balance, taking back the trade authority that Congress has allowed presidents to accumulate over decades. The bill has bipartisan support, but it faces the same obstacles as the resolution. It would have to pass both chambers and overcome a certain Trump veto. That's a heavy lift. Are you kidding me? Like, Congress has been complaining for years about how much power presidents have accumulated, but they've been too divided and too cowardly to actually do anything about it. Now finally, with Trump's tariffs causing real economic damage and Trump pushing the limits of executive authority to absurd extremes, Congress is trying to act, but they're running into the same problem they always have, which is that they can't get enough members to defy a president from their own party. Republicans in the House are terrified of Trump's base. They know that if they vote to limit Trump's authority, they'll face primary challenges from Trump-endorsed candidates. So they're stuck defending policies they know are economically harmful because the political cost of opposing Trump is too high. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court is wrestling with the same questions from a constitutional perspective. The cases before the court challenge Trump's tariffs on different legal grounds. Some argue that the IEEPA statute is so vague that it's an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power to the president. The Constitution says Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. If Congress passes a law giving the president unlimited discretion to impose tariffs whenever he declares an emergency, has Congress given away its constitutional authority? That's the question the court is grappling with. Justice Gorsuch's comments during oral argument suggest he thinks the answer is yes. He talked about the non-delegation doctrine, which is a constitutional principle that says Congress can't delegate its core legislative functions to the executive branch. If Congress gives away too much authority without clear standards for how that authority should be exercised, it violates separation of powers. The problem is that the Supreme Court hasn't enforced the non-delegation doctrine strictly in almost a century. Modern administrative law is built on the idea that Congress can give broad authority to executive agencies as long as there's some intelligible principle guiding how that authority should be used. The IEEPA arguably has an intelligible principle. It says tariffs can be imposed during national emergencies that threaten national security. But Trump has stretched the definition of national emergency so far that it barely constrains him at all. If every trade dispute is an emergency, then the president has unlimited tariff authority and the intelligible principle is meaningless. That's what Gorsuch seems to be concerned about. And if the court agrees with him, they could strike down Trump's tariffs as unconstitutional or at least impose much stricter limits on when IEEPA can be used. Come on, think about what this means for the balance of power. For decades, Congress has been ceding authority to presidents because it's easier to let the executive branch handle complicated policy issues than to legislate comprehensive solutions. But the consequence of that choice is that presidents keep accumulating more and more power until we reach a point where one person can unilaterally reshape huge portions of the economy without congressional input. That's not how the Constitution is supposed to work. The founders designed a system where power would be divided among three branches precisely to prevent any one person or institution from becoming too powerful. But if Congress won't defend its own constitutional prerogatives, if the courts defer to executive authority even when it's clearly being abused, then the system breaks down. Trump's tariff strategy is the perfect test case for these principles. He's using emergency powers designed for genuine crises to implement a trade policy that Congress would never have approved if he'd asked them. He's causing real economic harm to advance a nationalist trade agenda that most economists think is counterproductive. And he's doing it all without any meaningful check from the other branches of government, at least until now. The Senate resolution and the Supreme Court arguments represent the first serious pushback Trump has faced on tariffs. Whether that pushback succeeds in actually limiting his authority remains to be seen. Okay, so let's break down what this actually means for regular people and for the future of American government. First, the economic impact of Trump's tariffs. This isn't abstract policy debate. This is affecting people's lives right now. Small businesses that rely on imported materials are paying significantly higher prices. A manufacturer that imports steel to make products is seeing their costs go up 25% or more because of Trump's steel tariffs. They have to either absorb those costs, which hurts their profits and might force them to lay off workers, or pass them on to consumers, which makes their products more expensive and less competitive. Either way, the tariffs are causing economic pain. Farmers are getting hit even harder. When Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China retaliated with tariffs on American agricultural exports. Soybeans, pork, wheat, all the major crops that American farmers sell to China became much more expensive for Chinese buyers, so China started buying from Brazil, from Argentina, from other countries. American farmers lost market share and saw their incomes plummet. Trump tried to compensate them with bailout payments from the federal government, but those bailouts don't fully make up for lost sales, and they're not a long-term solution. Some farmers have gone bankrupt. Some have had to sell family farms that have been in their families for generations. The human cost of the trade war is real and it's substantial. Consumers are paying more for everything. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imports. When the government imposes a 25% tariff on Chinese electronics, American companies that import those electronics pay 25% more. Those companies pass most or all of that cost on to consumers. So when you buy a phone or a computer or a TV, you're paying more because of Trump's tariffs. Same thing with cars, appliances, clothes, all kinds of consumer goods. Studies have estimated that Trump's tariffs cost the average American household hundreds of dollars per year in higher prices. That might not sound like a lot, but for families living paycheck to paycheck, a few $100s is real money. Now let's talk about the constitutional principles at stake. The fight over tariffs is really a fight about separation of powers and who gets to make major policy decisions in America. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's in Article 1, Section 8. The founders put that power in Congress, not the executive branch, for good reason. They just fought a war against the king who could unilaterally control trade policy and use it to punish colonists. They didn't want to recreate that system in America. So they gave the trade power to Congress, which is supposed to be more accountable to the people and more deliberative in making major policy decisions. But over time, Congress has delegated more and more of that authority to presidents, sometimes for good reasons. The world moves fast, and Congress can't always react quickly enough to changing economic conditions. But there's supposed to be limits on how much authority Congress can give away. The non-delegation doctrine says Congress has to provide clear standards for how delegated authority should be used. If Congress just says do whatever you want, that's giving away legislative power in a way that violates the Constitution. The question in Trump's tariff cases is whether the IEEPA statute provides clear enough standards or whether it's essentially a blank check for presidents to impose whatever tariffs they want. If the Supreme Court rules that IEEPA is unconstitutional or imposes strict limits on when it can be used, that would be a landmark decision with implications far beyond trade policy. It would signal that the court is serious about enforcing separation of powers and limiting executive authority. It would affect how presidents use emergency powers in other areas like immigration, national security, maybe even domestic policy. Presidents have been relying on claims of emergency authority to bypass Congress for decades. A strong non-delegation ruling from the Supreme Court could put a stop to that practice or at least make it much harder. Can you believe we're at a point where a president can unilaterally impose tariffs on over 100 countries, and the only real check on that power is whether Congress can muster a veto-proof majority to stop him? That's not how the system is supposed to work. Presidents are supposed to propose policies, and Congress is supposed to debate them and decide whether to approve them. Instead, we flip the script where presidents act unilaterally and Congress can only stop them if they have a supermajority willing to override a veto. That's backwards. It gives presidents way too much power and makes Congress essentially irrelevant unless there's overwhelming bipartisan opposition to what the president is doing. The political dynamics here are also really interesting. Trump has built his entire brand around being tough on trade, around standing up to China and other countries that he claims have been taking advantage of America for decades. His base loves that message. They love the idea that finally we have a president who's willing to fight for American workers and American industries against unfair foreign competition. So when Congress tries to limit Trump's tariff authority, his supporters see it as the establishment trying to undermine America First policies. They see it as globalists and free trade advocates trying to tie Trump's hands so he can't deliver on his promises. That makes it really politically difficult for Republican members of Congress to vote against Trump on tariffs, even if they think the tariffs are economically harmful. Democrats have their own complicated relationship with trade policy. The party is divided between free trade advocates who think tariffs are economically counterproductive and labor-oriented progressives who think protecting American jobs from foreign competition is important. So Democrats aren't uniformly opposed to tariffs. Some of them actually support parts of Trump's trade agenda, especially the parts about getting tough on China. That makes it hard to build a unified Democratic position on limiting tariff authority. The Democrats who voted for the Senate resolution did so more because they think Trump is abusing emergency powers than because they're opposed to tariffs in principle. What happens next depends on a few different factors. First, will the House take up the Senate resolution or the new legislation limiting tariff authority? Probably not in the near term, but if economic conditions worsen and more Republicans start feeling political pressure from constituents hurt by tariffs, that could change. Second, how will the Supreme Court rule on the constitutional challenges? We probably won't get a decision until sometime next year, but if the court strikes down the tariffs or significantly limits when IEEPA can be used, that would force Trump to either stop imposing new tariffs or work with Congress to get authorization. Third, will Trump actually comply with any limits that Congress or the courts try to impose? That's the big unknown. Trump has shown repeatedly that he's willing to push legal boundaries and ignore institutional constraints when he thinks he can get away with it. One more thing to consider is the international dimension. Other countries are watching this fight closely. They want to know whether Trump's tariffs are going to be permanent policy or whether they might be rolled back if Congress or the courts intervene. If it looks like the tariffs might go away, other countries might be more willing to wait Trump out rather than negotiating new trade deals on his terms. If it looks like the tariffs are here to stay, countries might escalate their own retaliatory measures or look for ways to reduce their economic dependence on the United States. The uncertainty itself is damaging because it makes it hard for businesses and governments to plan for the future. So yeah, this congressional effort to strip Trump's tariff powers is a huge deal. It represents a long overdue attempt by Congress to reassert its constitutional authority over trade policy. It's happening at the same time the Supreme Court is questioning the constitutionality of Trump's emergency powers, and is creating massive uncertainty about the future of American trade policy and the balance of power between branches of government. Whether Congress and the courts succeed in limiting Trump's authority or whether Trump manages to hold onto his tariff powers remains to be seen. But this fight is going to shape American government and economic policy for years to come. Stay tuned, because the next few months are going to be absolutely critical in determining who actually controls U.S. trade policy and what limits exist on presidential power.